Ilan, thank you so much coming here, talking to us. Always great seeing you,
My
talking
pleasure.
to you. Well, you're like a resource that we can talk about many things, but let me start with your last trip. Where are you coming from?
Sure. I just got back from a research trip to China, actually, which is, for Americans anyway, a somewhat interesting place to go to these days. Not a lot of Americans are traveling to China. Not a lot of insight into what's actually happening in the country. It's increasingly what we would call a denied environment, where there's a lot of Americans who aren't allowed by the government to travel there, by the Chinese government, and are recommended by the American government not to travel there. So it was a really good opportunity to to talk to Chinese officials, also to hear their perspective on a whole bunch of issues, including on the Chinese relationship with Iran and sort of what they're looking at in the Middle East.
Let me start with that. We had two different China behavior in last 8 years. The China with Trump administration was very, very different.
Right.
Trump with Biden administration, regarding vis-a-vis Iran, I mean. How was the dynamic? Is it true that Trump called them and said, "Don't buy Iranian oil," and said, "Okay"? How does it work when it's coming to the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, it's interesting. The Chinese view on Iran, at least right now, seems to be very, very friendly and very protective. And what I mean by this is the Chinese government is of the mind that the Iranian regime is really not moving very aggressively in the region, and that in fact the Iranians are already sufficiently deterred by the United States. I think objectively that's not the case. And just like it's not the case, as the Chinese officials told us, that they don't have a lot of leverage. In fact, they have a tremendous amount of leverage over the regime in Tehran because of the 2021 framework deal worth $400 billion that they signed, that Beijing and Tehran signed back when Iran was still struggling with the effects of the Trump-era maximum pressure policy. Even so, the Chinese right now are very interested in Iranian oil. They're very interested in Iranian markets. And so I think there's a very hands-off attitude. I think the Chinese really want to engage with the Iranians. And as a result, everything they talk about when they talk about the Middle East conflict has to do with the need to restrain Israel as a way of tamping down tensions.
For Islamic Republic, there are lots of benefits having a relationship with China. They can, bypass sanctions. They can sell. They don't have to they don't have to abide by much of the international pressures and sanctions. But what China is getting out of this?
Well, cheap oil is one thing. The Iranian officials I spoke with were very clear that they think of Iran as
Chinese official you spoke.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, you said Iranian officials.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. The Chinese officials I spoke to were very clear that their government sees Iran as a significant source of energy, and will continue to see it. There's also the sense that I got was that even though that 25-year framework deal is mostly conceptual, it mostly hasn't really materialized, the sense that I got was that the Chinese are actually very interested in making greater inroads into the Iranian telecom sector, into Iranian infrastructure, and that their very conciliatory attitude towards Tehran is part of that. They're looking for a market opening. They're looking for a regime that is willing to play ball. And that requires them to run a little bit of interference, to try to, as much as they can, to pressure the United States to back down and to change the conversation in the Middle East.
There's a strange chess piece set now with China. North Korea, I think they are the main handler and controller of the North Korea. They're close to Islamic Republic. And because of Russia-Ukraine war, they are there as well. How China is moving with this, and how the war in Ukraine, is it helping them? Is it something that good comes out of it for them, or is it something that they prefer not to deal with it at the moment?
Well, it's interesting because I spent time when I was there, not just in Beijing, but I went up to the north to Heilongjiang province, which is the northernmost province. So there was a lot of conversations about China-Russia. And the perception I got was that the Chinese are very publicly very supportive of what they call the no limits partnership with Russia, very interested in expanding trade, but privately, quietly, they're a little bit concerned about the negative effects from the Ukraine war. China has felt detrimental diplomatic effects. China has been blamed for perpetuating the conflict. They're very defensive about that. And so it's a little bit of a mixed bag, I think. But you're absolutely right that we're seeing closer and closer coordination, primarily between Russia and China and Iran. North Korea also, but I think to a lesser extent. And to the point where people like former Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger now talks about an axis of chaos that is emerging. I think there are limits to that partnership. I think there is an inherent tension, for example, between Russia and China. The Chinese still have memories of territory that is now Russian that was taken from them. And I think the Chinese see Russia as a receding power. But at least for the time being, that coordination between Moscow and Tehran and Beijing serves a purpose, because all of them are united in their opposition to the United States. They're united in their opposition to the US-led liberal world order. And so you're seeing manifestations of this. You're seeing political coordination, you're seeing arms sales, you're even seeing military exercises. How far that goes, I think we have to wait and see, but it's very concerning.
We are close to presidential election in the United States. Harris campaign, apparently on Ukraine, they have the same policy that President Biden had. They just want to go. Republican side, they say, we will start it. This is not something that they want to go. What happens either way if there's a Harris administration? Right. What we will see over there, and if the Trump administration comes in? So
I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I certainly think that there's going to be more continuity than change if Vice President Harris becomes president. I think there is a commitment from the administration in general of supporting Ukraine. I think that commitment really isn't going to go away, but it will face more and more pressure from Congress, as it is now, because there is a sense that simply giving Ukraine money indefinitely is probably not a smart strategy. But the perception that the Trump administration will immediately cancel aid to Ukraine, I don't know if that's true. And my sense is a lot of what Ukraine is doing now, including the daring military incursion that it's made into Russian territory itself, right, which is now, as we're sitting down recording this, is now in its third week, is intended precisely for this sort of audience. It's intended to show that with the proper freedom of action, Ukraine can actually turn the tables. Ukraine can actually fight back, battle back against the Kremlin in a pretty significant way. And I think if that message holds, it may be possible for the Ukrainians to tell a new Trump administration, hey, listen, we know that you don't want to be committed to this for the long term, but we need a little bit more aid, we need a little bit more time, but set us free, let us be what we can be, and you'll see victory. And that may be a message that resonates with a new administration in Washington. So I'm not sure that you're looking down the path of simply saying that as soon as Trump comes in, there won't be any more aid for Ukraine.
Yeah, but he said, I'll end the war right away or so. So probably, I don't know what kind of pressure or proposal.
No, that's correct. But that's a pretty open-ended statement. How do you end the war? Does it end with a Russian victory, or does it end with a Ukrainian victory? Does it end with some sort of settlement? Right? There's a lot that can be read into that. I think his overriding priority is that the conflict ends sooner rather than later. How it ends, it depends on who he perceives to be on top at the moment.
We talked about Islamic Republic benefiting from China, relationship with China. But China is good and strong as long as its economy works well, which means that they are dependent to many countries in the world for that. So, which means they have some limitation how they can work. Do Islamic Republic really sees any future on long term, not just about the money or telecommunication, but something that they could, get them on the level with China, because they admire how the Chinese people are repressing, but at the same time are very strong economically as well.
Right, and by the way, not so strong economically now, and I think that's a critical point. The Chinese model, the attractiveness of what China is selling, not just to Iran, but to the global South in general, depends on the Chinese economy working well, depends on the regime looking competent, the regime looking in control. They're having real problems now. They had very public failures in terms of the pandemic, in terms of their zero COVID policy. Their Belt and Road Initiative, which is the signature foreign policy initiative of the Chinese government, has spent something like $1 trillion on infrastructure in the third world, and there's not a lot of return for investment. The Chinese real estate sector is doing terribly right now. And so there's a lot of sort of questions, I think, globally about where China is heading. And that's why a lot of what I heard when I was in Beijing was a softer tone, because I think the Chinese understand that they have to rebuild confidence primarily from international audiences, so they can start once again to attract investment, start once again to be seen as a good model. So I don't know that I know the answer to that question, because my sense is that a lot of how attractive Iran perceives China depends on what China does. It's very clear that the model of rigid state control, the model of techno-authoritarianism is very appealing to the regime. But it is only appealing if the regime feels like China can really give them the tools to do the same. And if China is not in a position to do that, I think the relationship remains minimal. But I do think that on balance, what China has managed to do in terms of controlling its own population, in terms of controlling the things that its own population reads and sees and believes, is very much a model that the Ayatollahs would like to harness.
China in some ways tried to expand some other new, deeper relationships with the BRICS, with the Shanghai. They admitted Islamic Republic into Shanghai. Is China capable of running its own corner of the world businesses without having anything to do with the United States?
So I think that's a real question. It's very clear that the aggressive, confrontational foreign policy that China has pursued over the last 5 years or so has really created a lot of local reaction. The establishment of the Quad Alliance, for example, the increasing focus on defense capabilities in Taiwan, the increasing focus on defense capabilities in Japan, right? The list goes on. So I think this is something that the Chinese government understands and the Chinese government is aware of, that a lot of what they've done has created negative, for them, reactions. And so I don't know whether this creates a different balance in Beijing moving forward, but it's very clear that the Chinese, who just a few years ago really thought that the world was going their way, really now see more problems than they did before in terms of the international environment that they're trying to navigate.
Last question I have to ask about China. I have other questions for you, but last on China. China tends to give financial loans with no string attached, which I'm sure authoritarian governments love that. And most of them are in the Middle East, and just Islamic Republic and the all of that. But some of those countries on Persian Gulf, there used to be like close, long allies of the United States. Do you think China can grab them with the financial no string attachment and some other incentives like military assistance or other things that they're asking now from the United States?
Well, this is really a good question. So first of all, I don't think it's no strings attached. I think if you look at what China has been doing in places like Africa and Latin America, if the countries are weaker, then there are absolutely strings attached, because if those governments can't repay their loans, then China takes the payment in reducing the sovereignty of those countries, taking over property, taking over strategic resources. I think the situation, though, is a little bit different in the Middle East. When you have strong, powerful, resourceful countries like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, the Chinese approach is very different. But it's very, what you're saying is exactly right. You have a lot of governments that are authoritarian or authoritarian leaning. And so the Chinese model is very attractive because as part of this engagement, China is offering them tools to control and shape the opinions of their populations better. So the real worry that a lot of us here in Washington have is that this sort of repression, the techno-authoritarianism, becomes an export commodity along the Belt and Road because China is offering either cheap or free tools of social control as part of its engagement. And so this could lead to the Persian Gulf, but also Africa and Latin America becoming more illiberal over time and a more difficult place for America to engage over time.
Well, by the strings that attach, I mean, financially, yes, lots of string, but I mean, if they're borrowing money from the United States, they have to be mindful about human rights, money laundering, right. Black market or so. Right. But with China, I mean, there's no string attached. They can do anything they want with that money.
No, correct, right. So I would call it value-free investing. The Chinese don't care, you're absolutely right, they don't care very much, if at all, about human rights. They don't care about political ideology. They don't care about transparency or anti-corruption. In fact, they prefer all these things that America is trying to ameliorate in the Middle East because they make those governments more compliant. They make those governments better client states of the People's Republic. That's absolutely true. The question really becomes that for America is how deep that corruption that is associated with this sort of value-free investing, how deep does it go? How sorry. How deep does it go? How much worse will Chinese engagement make the regimes that are already engaged in problematic practices? We don't know the answer to that question. I think we're beginning to be able to make a guess.
One thing, whenever I talk to someone about the Uyghurs in China, they point at media, says media is not keeping it alive. Right. But you've been there.
Yeah.
We have reports from the worst atrocities over there, right. From the very fair, independent media organizations. How is it that it's just calm and quiet and no one talks about it and no one addresses it? Do they even have any idea inside what's happening in the Xinjiang?
So this is interesting, right? There's an inside game and an outside game. Inside, the media is media reporting of conditions in Xinjiang is very suppressed. There's not a lot of free data, and there's a lot of very powerful messaging and talking points from the Chinese government that trickles down to state and local officials about how there's really nothing to see here. Everything's fine. On the outside of China, the Chinese have been very smart, and what they've actually done is they have harnessed engagement and they've harnessed money. And what I mean by this is, in terms of engagement, they have invited representatives, officials, or religious clergy from majority Muslim countries to come visit on very carefully curated tours that don't really show them the things that America's concerned about, that the UN is concerned about. And afterwards, those people essentially give China a clean bill of health. They say, hey, listen, we didn't see anything bad, everything's fine. And at the same time, you have China investing very, very heavily in these governments, which forces them or incentivizes them to not look too closely at what China is doing. A great example of this is Turkey. A few years ago, Turkey was one of the very few countries that was raising the alarm over what was happening with the Uyghurs, until the Central Bank of China made a $1 billion investment in the Turkish economy. And since then, Turkey's been silent, right? So the lesson that the Chinese are learning is actually a very dangerous one. It's that money gives them the freedom to do whatever they want to their own internal population without causing any sort of serious international outcry.
Switching to Islamic Republic of Iran, there's a high tension between Islamic Republic of Iran and Israel, sure, since the killing of Hania. Do you think that calming in some ways, or it's just waiting for something to happen?
It's interesting because clearly the path is one towards greater escalation. I think this, in many ways, the cards are very much in the Islamic Republic's hands. The Iranian regime has the ability to decide whether or not to retaliate for Hania. Remember that Israel has claimed responsibility for a whole lot of killings, including the killing of Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr in Lebanon, but it hasn't officially claimed responsibility for the killing of Hania, right? There's speculation, of course, but for the moment at least, it has plausible deniability. Iran, the Iranian regime, has the ability to step down and to de-escalate. It's a choice of the regime because of national pride, because of religious imperative about whether or not they want to escalate, right? The choice is theirs. But what's very clear from the Israeli side is that Israel is looking at the war in Gaza and the current security situation that it faces as a multi-front war. It's fighting primarily right now in Hamas, although in recent days it's gone into the West Bank as well. But it actually sees a multi-front war, and on all of these fronts, in the West Bank, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, right, on the internet, right, all these other places, the Islamic Republic is very present as a danger. The Islamic Republic is paying proxies that are hostile to Israel. The Islamic Republic is doing things that are detrimental to Israeli security. So this situation, the potential for Iranian retaliation for the Hania killing may pass. We may not see an escalation. But my sense is that as Israel begins to look at all these different fronts, the potential for more direct, maybe not fully direct, but more direct conflict between Jerusalem and Tehran actually becomes greater.
There are two hypotheses between Islamic Republic, Iran, and Israel. One would suggest that Islamic Republic Iran cannot do conventional war with Israel. Right. They know they lose. But what they're good at is like proxies, right, terror tactics, killing dissidents anywhere. So that might what they pursue. The other hypothesis is that although Khamenei said openly, just let's go after Israel or so, nothing is done. Is there a sign that maybe Khamenei is not taking that much seriously now because he's frail, or they're just fighting for his replacement? Is this something says about the inside politics of Islamic Republic?
Well, so I actually think that I'm very much in favor of the first hypothesis, not so much the second. I don't think the failure of Iran to act so far is a function of regime weakness. But I do think it's a function of the fact that the Iranian regime, at least for now, is seeking to avoid direct force-on-force competition. It's much more comfortable, right? The history of the last 2 decades has shown Iran is much more comfortable fighting a war of attrition against Israel, against the United States, using proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Houthi rebels in Yemen, or Shiite militias in Iraq, to try to kill Israel with the death of 1,000 cuts, or try to kill the United States with the death of 1,000 cuts. It's far less interested in direct military-to-military confrontation. But whether or not that's a reflection of regime weakness or of political divisions, I don't think so. At least not yet. It's very clear that, and for your audience and for people who watch Iran closely, it's very clear that Iran is on the cusp of some significant political decisions in terms of the succession of the supreme leader, in terms of recent political changes with the death of the former president, the election of President Pezeshkian in his place. But that, to me at least, doesn't suggest that the regime is fragmenting to such a degree that they're not able to control their strategy. At least not yet.
We are getting close to anniversary of Mahsa Amini's killing inside Iran. We see the change of the government, new government starts working. One thing hasn't changed since the whole Mahsa Amini killing. The suppression, killings, tortures, never stopped, never went down. It's still going constantly. How is it sustainable for the Islamic Republic to go this direction?
So it's sustainable until it's not, right? But what's very clear is that over the last year, many of us had very high hopes for the potential for change within Iran brought about by the groundswell of popular discontent caused by Mahsa Amini's killing. But what became apparent over time is that the Women Life Freedom movement was losing steam because of a lack of international attention. For better or worse, there was a failure on the part of the West to buy in, to really support the brave Iranian protesters the way they should have been supported, to give them the resources that they needed. And as the protests have declined in terms of potency, in terms of size, in terms of frequency, the confidence of the regime has risen. So a lot of what you're seeing now, whether it's the return of the morality police to the streets of Tehran and other cities, whether it is the sort of increased surveillance and control and reporting on women who don't follow the religious edict to wear the hijab, whatever it is, that's a sign that the regime has regained its balance and it's pushing back. But fundamentally, I think what we've seen over the last year and a half, 2 years, has been that a threshold has been crossed. Something is different now. What started as a outpouring of hostility because of the hijab has become this much more fundamental rejection of the regime as a whole. And that's a problem. That's a problem for the regime. And it's a problem that's going to resurface probably sooner rather than later, right? If you look at the recent history of protests in the Islamic Republic, you see that they recur again and again, but they're doing so more and more frequently. So what we saw in 2022, we're likely to see in 2025. And the regime knows this, and that's why it's spending all its capital, all its money, all its military power to try to proactively create conditions where it's hard for the Iranian people to move around, it's hard for them to connect, it's hard for them to communicate, because their idea is, I think, a very calculating one. The more we can fragment the opposition, the smaller the threat posed by the opposition will be as a opposition to the regime.
Do you think Islamic Republic can survive women life freedom? As you said, it started now it's in a different phase. It's not like anything that we've seen from the Grieve movements till now.
I think if the question is, can they survive the current protests, I think the answer is yes, unfortunately. If the question is, can they survive the changes that the protests have put in motion, I don't think so. Because we're seeing a very fundamental change. If you look back at the Green Movement of 2009, it was very clear from watching the protests there that the goal of the protests were behavior change of the current regime. And in fact, people like Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, they were part of the old regime. They were not, you couldn't expect them to be fundamental change makers in the regime. They were just trying to change the behavior. That's not what you're seeing now. What you're seeing now is something much more fundamental, a break with the Islamic Republic, and it's being driven by discontent with the regime on a political level. It's being driven by increasing lack of religiosity among the Iranian people, right? Because religiosity within the Islamic Republic has declined precipitously. It's being driven by demographic change because 2/3 of the Iranian population is 40 or younger, right? Which means that they weren't around at the time of the 1979 revolution. They know what they're missing. This is not North Korea, right? So all of these things are coming together to suggest that what we're going to witness over the next few years is a pretty profound transformation. This is a challenge for the regime, but it's also a wake-up call, I think, for the international community, because the interests of the United States, the interests of the international community are much better served by engaging with the opposition, by understanding these changes, by empowering these changes, so that what we can end up with is a post-theocratic Iran that isn't a threat to Western interests.
Last question, if I may. If Islamic Republic comes to the point and I say, okay, I grant you these liberties like hijab, do you think they can find a way to reconcile with the population? Because most of the opposition or we talk to say there's no going back, especially with the more killing and more they just executions and it goes on. People say we're not going back. Right. Do you think there is a point that is still Islamic Republic will be sustainable, or if Islamic Republic likes to be China very fast,
Right.
to be able just to crack down everything and nothing can happen without their knowledge.
So I think that second alternative is actually much more likely. I think there's a limit to what what the Iranian regime can allow the population to do. What's very clear is that even despite his campaign promises, the president of Iran, the current president of Iran, has not delivered. He hasn't been able to deliver a liberalization of women's dress, a less restrictive approach to religious edicts. Right. Part of that is a function of the presidency. The presidency within the Islamic Republic does not really have any serious power. But part of it is also the constraints that the regime is operating under. It's true that the regime can give certain things to certain constituencies to make them less active. If the economy does better, certain people won't come out in the streets. If people have better internet or better television, certain people will be satisfied. But I think what we're looking at is a different situation now. We're looking at a situation where there's been a fundamental break between the people and the regime. And the only way that the regime can control it is through force. So I think that model where the Iranians lean in to the Chinese model, lean into this sort of techno-authoritarianism and rigid state control is much more likely.
Thank you so much for your time, Ilan. I really appreciate it.